If you work in quality control at a candy factory, you know strict safety regulations come with the job. It's why you partner with Grainger. Grainger helps you find the high-quality and compliant products your business needs to inspect, detect, and help correct issues. And the sweetest part is, everyone gets a product that's as safe to eat as it is delicious. Call 1-800-GRAINGER, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
Hello listeners, and welcome to Season 2 of The Cult Vault. As some of you may know, we have now officially launched. For anyone who would like to listen back to Season 1, you'll find my personal journey through cult education taking place from one episode to the next, going from knowing nothing at all to knowing at least a little bit about cults and coercion today in Season 2. Season 1 has some questionable audio quality and a lot of me rambling on, but some incredible guests whose stories are equally as important as anything that happens in Season 2. My aim for Season 2 is that you will find less of me rambling on and better audio quality. If you do find the content interesting or helpful, please consider rating or reviewing the show wherever you listen to your podcasts, or subscribe to the YouTube channel. I also have a Patreon page at patreon.com/thecultvault, where you can pledge to the show for exclusive and ad-free content. All of these links I've mentioned I will post in the episode description. If you're still here from Season 1, hello, and thank you so much. And if you are just finding the show now, welcome. I hope you find this content educational. And now, onto the show. Hello listeners, and welcome to a bonus episode of The Cult Vault. This audio was taken from a live recording that I did in my bedroom with an old friend, Sam, just last week. You can watch the live interview back on YouTube, and hopefully this conversation will bring light to how smaller church congregations may be abusing scripture and in turn abusing congregants right on our doorsteps. We might have friends who have experienced these things and who are still in recovery and deconstruction when we spend every day of our lives with these people and have absolutely no idea. So let's start having these conversations. And to start this off, here is Sam, my good friend and cult survivor. Hi, Sam, and thank you for this live show with me. We've known each other now over a decade.
Yeah.
And I'm about to hear this story for the first time ever, which is really strange. I don't really know. You've given me a little bit of insight, but I know that there's going to be a... So would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes. So my name's Sam. I'm from Leeds, which is in Yorkshire in the north of England. In my work life, I work in theatre and the arts, theatre, direct and produce. And I teach as well at universities across the north. And that's me.
Would you say the theatre's always been a part of your life?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I come from a very musical family and did a lot of drama and theatre growing up.
That was something we bonded over quite early on, actually.
Yeah.
We were talking about how we'd both done certain singing grades and...
Oh, yeah.
So that was really interesting. And then met at performing arts schools.
Yeah.
So that's how me and Sam came to know one another. And actually, really funny story, Sam broke my nose one time. We were in a movement class and we were supposed to do this thing where you run towards each other, kind of like a trust exercise, and then you kind of stop at the last second and then split apart, and Sam just kept on coming.
We just didn't stop.
His forehead went into my nose, elbow went into my sternum, and he symmetrically broke me, and I was in hospital with a broken nose and a broken sternum. So
but it made us closer.
It did bring us closer. I mean, laughing aside, we are going to be talking about some heavy subject matter today and personal subject matter for you. And you said that even though you are going to be talking on video for the first time about this today, there are a few other people who have had this similar experience in this group that are also speaking out online.
Yeah, so there's a fair amount of forums online that people who've been involved in it, and you're talking hundreds of pages of people writing, and I think there's a bit of a community growing around it, people responding to posts and sharing memories. and then a few people who've individually blogged about it as well.
Okay.
So I've kind of read what other people have said, which is really useful to see and think, oh no, it's not just me. There's quite a lot of people.
Is it stuff that, even though you're not living in that part of the world full time, is still relatable or recognizable?
Yeah, I think so. And the group, this church has quite a long history, so it's also interesting to read what people experienced, maybe even before I was born, that these kind of practices have a long history and that they still continue. Yeah.
And that's actually kind of perfect to lead us into the first segment, in talking about the name of the group, the history of the group, a brief summary, and where you fit into that timeline.
Yeah. So the name of the group, it's a group of churches, independent churches that are based in Scotland, and they have various branch churches as well in other parts of the UK. The group is called the Struthers Memorial Church, and the church, the particular branch that I was a part of in Leeds, was called the Fartown Christian Fellowship. They've been going since the mid 1950s. They were started by a man called Mr. Black and his friend Miss Taylor, and they both came from very conservative Christian backgrounds. I think he was a part of the Brethren before, which I know you've spoken about before, and that kind of sense of living apart from the world and separateness and holiness and purity, and together with Miss Taylor, they started in a little house, a kind of gathering of like-minded people. And after a few years, they got enough pennies together to buy a church building, which they did in Greenock in Scotland.
Okay.
And that was and remains the kind of mother church of the whole movement.
Like the HQ.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So if they built the mothership in Scotland, but you're from Leeds, Yorkshire, please tell us how that all ties together.
So they kind of spread throughout Scotland with a similar kind of pattern, going to places, speaking to people, and converting people, really.
Okay.
And then they would start little house churches, and after a few years get enough money together as a group to buy a building. And Mr. Black had been in Bradford, which is, so the town that I'm from is between Leeds and Bradford. And he'd been in Bradford and preaching to people, and most of them were already Christians. It's not like he was meeting people who didn't have any faith or belief.
Right.
He was meeting like-minded people and saying, but have you thought about this?
Okay.
And kind of pulling them out of their churches. They started in a little house church in the town, and some people came down from Scotland. They had a mini conference and then regularly met there. And similarly, after 3 years, had rubbed enough money together to buy a church, which was an old, empty Sunday school that they bought and started running their church from.
And is that the building that is still in use today?
So the movement still carries on, and they've got churches in Scotland. There's a church in Wales, and a group in London who used to have a building, but now I don't believe they do. The church in my town, before lockdown, when they went into COVID and lockdown, they stopped meeting, and since COVID haven't met again.
Okay.
And the building has been sold.
The Struthers Memorial Church is still in existence.
Yes.
But the Fartown group itself went out of commission, so to speak, just before lockdown.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So we're right. Okay. I've got it. I'm with you. I'm there. So you mentioned to me before we were recording today that you were technically, very, very technically, you were raised Catholic.
Yes.
And you found yourself part of the Fartown group. So can you tell the listeners a little bit about you and your family, your upbringing, and what all of that looked like?
Yeah, so I mean, I had a very happy upbringing, with a nice, great kind of big family, and we, my parents were baptized and raised Catholic. Their parents were, so we were baptized Catholic and went to Catholic school, and largely because in the area we're growing up in, the Catholic schools were just the better schools. So that was kind of, and I think my parents are a little bit more kind of in the community, but they're not. No one's really a church goer in the family. The way that the church, the Fartown Fellowship, they had a youth club on a Friday night. That was really successful as a youth club. Like thousands of kids must have gone through the doors.
Wow.
Right from like being 3 or 4 years old up to the lower end of high school. And there wasn't really anything like that anywhere else in the town. So it was just the local youth club that we went to.
Right.
And it was a normal youth club, go in, sing some songs, play some games. There might be a little bit of gaudy stuff and a bit about the Bible at the end. But that's kind of how I first kind of ended up stepping into that building and being with the people there, in what was just felt like a normal youth club. Yeah.
So when you first went to the youth club, what age were you?
Maybe 7 or 8. Yeah.
And you didn't go, or your family didn't start the anticipation of it being a religious thing?
I mean, I think knowing that it was in a church it wasn't that's why we were going there, but it was fine.
Okay.
Because kind of in that, Catholic schools, it's like they weren't bothered that we'd hear a little bit of Bible stuff at the end of youth club. That wasn't a problem, but it wasn't why we were there.
Okay.
We were there for the youth club. Yeah.
Okay. And you said it was a successful youth club, so maybe it was that kept you there.
Yeah.
But how did things progress after the ages of 7 and 8? Is it because there was a lot of music involved and that's what you really loved and enjoyed? Paint that whole picture for us on how you became like a core member of this group.
So the I think the process is quite individual in that as we got into the lower end, the upper end of primary school, which is, for American listeners, at elementary school, I think that finishes at the same age.
So
we were maybe
bad
10 or 11 years old before we would go to secondary school or high school. A few of us stopped going to youth club because we felt like we'd grown out of it. So they started an age bracket a little bit higher, and the idea was we'd help out with some of the younger kids, and then we'd go off and do our own stuff as slightly older kids.
Right.
So some of us went back and we brought new friends with us from high school. And it was just really fun. We'd play a lot of games. We'd have a good giggle. We had to sit and hear slightly more Bible teaching and discussions around that, which we didn't mind because we were all kind of used to that kind of thing anyway. Yeah. What they would do after the youth club was the adults, and I'm saying adults, this was maybe kind of 17, 18-year-olds and upwards, would stay back, tidy up. They'd have toasties and sandwiches and cans of iron brew and Coca-Cola and all that. And then they would have what they called a student meeting.
Okay.
So it was aimed at university age people. It's not a university town, so that was kind of, it was really just for the people running the youth club to have, and that was like a private church meeting, full blown. And what happened was, after a while, some of us were asked, and I think I was maybe 12, 13, would we like to stay back 1 week and join that after? And that's where we really started to engage with what was kind of what the actual church did, as opposed to what the youth club was, what their actual religious practices were.
So it's almost like the youth club was the front for what was happening in the back.
Yes. The idea is that you would age through the youth club and eventually become a part of the church.
Okay.
Which, I mean, I say it was a successful youth club because loads of people went, but if that's the purpose of it, fairly unsuccessful because the church always remained at kind of 30 or 40 members. But that the time that we stayed back for that first meeting, that was the time where we all kind of realized and went, oh. And I think the journey after that is really interesting because some of us then stuck with it, even though our first impressions of it were like, we need to get out of this place.
Yeah,
this is wild.
Well, I mean, have you deconstructed that and kind of asked yourself why you stuck with it?
Yeah, so that first meeting was really bizarre to it was a kind of religious setup that none of us were used to.
Okay.
So we were kind of sat quietly, and there was an opening of prayer. So the person at the front led some prayer, and then there was time for singing. And in a Catholic church, people just stand up and sing quite quietly. And actually, people were stood up singing really loud, and it was arms in the air kind of worship, swaying, and things that maybe are actually quite mainstream in evangelical Christianity that none of us had actually ever experienced before and weren't expecting. So that felt quite jarring.
Yeah.
Then we all sat down, and there was a sermon, and I think it was about the three wise men. We were near Christmas. But the big kind of like punch was at the end when it was time to move into the worship time, when the leader started praying again, and everybody around us is speaking in tongues, and none of us had experienced anything like that. And sometimes if you've ever heard anyone speaking in tongues, it can sound quite peaceful or meditative, but this was loud and kind of shouting. People were crying, and as young people sat there feeling like we had to keep our eyes closed, it just felt so unsafe. And we all just wanted to leave, but didn't feel like we could. So then when we did leave, and our parents kind of said, "Oh, how was it?" It was just like, "Yep, fine." We didn't even feel like we could talk about it.
And you're like 13 at this.
Yeah, 12, 13. And so following this, what was really interesting was we all got to school the next week. And of course, the first thing we did was made a massive joke out of it.
Right.
So we were kind of pretending to be them and laughing. And I mean, I think that's quite a healthy way of coping with what had happened.
I mean, acknowledgement of some type, isn't it?
And then as we got through the week and close to Friday night session, it became difficult for us to say, well, we're not going, because some of them that did this from high school who hadn't necessarily been there since they were 7 or 8 years old, they'd maybe come for a few weeks, and then that was their experience, and they said, nope, we're out. The rest, there was 2 or 3 of us who felt like, we know these people, they're really nice, they're really fun. Can we really just stop going to this thing that we've enjoyed for 5 or 6 years? Do we just kind of go with it, give them the benefit of the doubt? And we kept going a little bit. And then in school, a couple of us became a little bit uncomfortable with how jokey and it was, and how everyone was taking the mick out of it. Because we did feel like, actually, no, these are people we've known for a long time. We respect them. We kind of see them as friends. And I think quite rightly, actually, our friends were just said to us, you're being absolutely ridiculous. You shouldn't go there. And we all felt quite defensive, and we're like, well, you don't know them. And of course, the first thing that the leadership at the church did was capitalize on that and kind of say, well, it doesn't matter if they don't understand. We'll be your friends. You can come here now, and you can hang out with us, and you can come to church on a weekend, help out with Sunday school. Well, it's not right what they're saying. We'll be that community. And so over time, there was a few of us that then dug into it a bit more and got a bit more stuck in and felt like we were doing the right thing. But looking back, actually, those leaders should have said, have you spoken to a teacher about this? Do your parents know? What's the situation here?
Well, aside from the sort of information control or lack of transparency with other adults of influence in your life at that time, as you've just mentioned there, primary caregivers, teachers, on paper, a group getting together, doing some worship, speaking in tongues, it emotionally overwhelming, I imagine, but there's no over abuse taking place at this point. It sounds like initially this thing started out as something that was never supposed to be abusive. Would you say that's a fair assumption?
I think it's a step-by-step kind of getting into these environments. And so actually, when you think, no, it's okay that they sing quite loud and are expressive in their worship, and that there's speaking in tongues and things like that. But once you kind of buy into that within this group anyway, then the leadership take another little bit and say, well, actually, have you thought about, should you really be speaking to that person anymore? Should you be friends with that person? Should you be watching that TV show or listening to that kind of music? Should you really be going to this place? It's give a little bit and then take a little bit more, I think, is how it evolved.
Well, you joined at a point where this church had been established for a number of decades.
Mm-hmm.
So this is not something that is trial and error for this church group at this point. It's become something that's pretty well refined.
Yeah.
And the methods that are being used to new congregants are things that have been used on many others previously.
Yeah.
Right, okay. So if you're 13 at this time, and by the time I meet you when you're 18, and this is something you're fully involved in at that point, how do you get from being slightly uncomfortable but a bit defensive of this group to fully buying into it and becoming so involved that it kind of takes a big thing like university to like pull you out of that?
So I think by the time I got to university, I was out of it.
Right.
I'd left maybe a year and a half, 2 years before, but obviously coming to university was a huge culture shock because there were things like pop references that I didn't know,
Wow.
films I'd never heard of, TV shows I'd never watched. So that's maybe the kind of
I never
sense
would have
that you
ever
would get
thought
from
that.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness, I never would have.
Yeah.
Okay.
But in terms of it is really building a community. And I don't think for a second that, and I know that of some organisations this is true and some it isn't, but I don't think for a second they think they're being coercive.
Right.
I don't think they recognise that they're using strategies to bring people in that way. I think they think they're doing a good thing. But actually, there's no transparency in terms of what is going to happen, the full set of beliefs, what's expected of people in the church. I think for me, it was more the sense of if you've experienced one thing and that feels true, then why wouldn't the next thing also be true?
Yeah, I think a few people have talked about that on the show before, where they've spoken about not being sure about something and then having an experience that feels perhaps otherworldly or connected spiritually to some biblical or religious text that they're reading at the time, and then it's kind of confirmation bias.
Yeah.
So, I must be on the right track, or maybe this is the right thing for me because all of a sudden these things have clicked into place, which perhaps would have happened even if people hadn't been starting to get involved in these groups in the first place, which is quite interesting to think about, I think. But in terms of the things you mentioned there, not being transparent with the belief systems or what would be expected of you as a teenager going into this group, can you talk us through what the belief systems looked like and how they might differ from traditional Christianity?
So I think certainly maybe with an American audience, what mainstream Christianity looks like in the UK is quite different. So they are a fundamentalist church. So they believe through and through that the Bible is literally true, which is less mainstream in the UK as it is in other parts of the world. Certainly a belief in purity and holiness. So not being exposed to things of the world. So this would be things like most of the members didn't have a TV, not listening to any music that wasn't Christian music, not listening to any Christian music that had too heavy a beat.
Wow.
Because you shouldn't dance for music, you should only dance for God.
Okay, yeah.
Core beliefs of some core beliefs of Christianity, so things like the Trinity, the resurrection, and then obviously a real emphasis on Pentecost, the Holy Spirit, and the gifts of the Holy Spirit. So things like speaking in tongues, prophecy, discernment, deliverance, all of those things. And that's really what the meetings, as they called them, would center around. So it was all about how do you on earth experience more of a feeling of God? How do you feel more like you are actually in the presence of God?
If it's a slow funneling into this group, how do they introduce you to those belief systems? Is it like a pyramid almost? You join and you have lessons that introduce you slowly to the belief system, or is it you go to one of these sessions everybody else is aware of what the practice is and what the beliefs are, and you're just kind of thrown into it and you have to learn as you go.
So some of it we kind of knew before we even went to that first meeting. So they'd spoken about things like speaking in tongues, but we'd all read like the Acts of the Apostles at school, so we'd heard of speaking in tongues,
Right.
but we didn't know what that would be actually like to sit in and hear and experience. Certainly the kind of rules of things that you can and can't do. You weren't, for example, allowed to pursue any sort of romantic relationship until you're an adult, and even then it would have to be with the permission of the leadership.
Okay.
And obviously that's something that you don't kind of hear until you've bought in a little bit, because most people would say, why would I give this person control over who I can and can't marry? So and in some ways, obviously, any kind of religious organization can't just list off the complexity of all their beliefs in one go and let everyone know what that is. But you can also prepare people. And I think even basic things like a website with if your beliefs are that kind of complex, it needs more than 5 sentences about.
Yeah.
And also the way that the church is built as a movement with yearly kind of gatherings of the whole movement, and different things would happen even then.
Oh, cool. Right. In another group, they would call that the Feast of the Tabernacle. So sort of like a yearly.
Yeah, so we call it a conference. So it'd be
Okay.
we would go up to Scotland. There would be a New Year conference, an Easter conference, and then there was 2 in the summer, and then a youth one in the autumn as well.
So would any of these be classed as retreats where you'd go for like a number of days?
Yeah, so the ones in the summer were a week long each, and it would be we'd go to a kind of centre in the countryside, with a huge hall where everybody would gather for the huge kind of meetings, and we would do that for twice a day, and some of them would last for 2 or 3 hours a time.
Right. Okay. And
or like long into the night.
Well, I was going to ask if it kind of progressed from that point, but what age were you when you first started to attend these retreats?
14, I think, 13, 14.
And your parents at that point are well aware of your willingness to be involved in the youth group.
Yeah. But by this point, I was going to this church Friday night, Saturday night, Sunday morning, Sunday evening, sometimes a Monday evening, and sometimes a Wednesday evening as well.
Oh my goodness!
So it was just my social life. I had school during the week, and I did other things around. I was still doing things like a choir and an orchestra and drama classes and local and school productions and things. But this was really the core thing that I was living for and digging into. Yeah.
So if you're sort of committing so much of your life to church-related activities for these meetings, then you're well aware of the full-rounded belief system.
Yes, yeah.
And are you expected to tithe or anything for these meetings? Because you're going quite a lot. So if you were to tithe like people might at a typical church or a regular church, then that would get pretty costly.
Yeah, so young people weren't, but the general idea is that adults would usually give over about 10% of their income.
Okay.
Which I think is fairly standard even in kind of mainstream churches. You would find that there wasn't. I think you find in a lot of more contemporary mega churches that there'll be actually a section of the service dedicated to talking about giving money and planting the seed, and the plants will grow and your money will come back to you. And actually there wasn't any of that. The financial stuff was actually kind of the opposite. It was quite quiet, and there is some. I can't speak on it too much because this is from the 70s, so I wasn't around. But there is some talk online about financial issues that the church had at one point that people were asked to kind of bail out. But again, that's not me. That's
right.
You can read about that online. I don't think. I had pocket money, but I don't think it went to. I mean, I probably spent it in the little like Friday night tuck shop.
Yeah, the tuck shop. The tuck shop. I don't know if you use that term in America, but in every school over here, there's the tuck shop where you can go and get your your candy and your chips and whatnot at break time.
Yeah.
And your pop.
Yeah.
What would they have, like dandelion and burdock?
Yeah.
Cream
like,
soda.
Yeah.
Oh no.
But in terms of the structure, there was a rank structure. So each, and it was pronounced and some of it wasn't. So there was a kind of, currently there's a leader called Mary Grace Gold, and then each church has its own kind of lead minister. None of them are paid for it, so the money just goes into kind of buildings and upkeep and things like that.
Okay.
But then, as with other groups, what you get then around the leaders is almost like an inner circle.
Okay.
Of people who are sometimes asked to preach or lead worship, and actually that can then be used if you're not turning up enough, or not quite have the right energy about you. Like, no, you can't lead the singing today. And obviously that will be a huge blow to somebody. What's wrong with me? Why am I not accepted anymore? So I suppose there's like a softer rank of leadership as well.
Okay. It's interesting to hear more stories coming from this side of the pond, especially because it's something that I have been around and didn't even realize until I started this podcast. So I had absolutely no idea. I knew that you'd had involvement. You mentioned having difficult church experiences, but I never figured that it would be anything like this. So were you expected to pay for any of these residentials that you went on? Would they be like summer camp?
Yeah.
Okay.
We were expected to pay, and our own church in Leeds as well would have its. We do our own, so we'd go away like into the Yorkshire Dales and hire like a little converted barn that was now like a bunk barn, and maybe 15 or 20 of us would go for a weekend as well.
Wow. So when you go to these retreats and gatherings, there's the opportunity for you to socialize with kids from other parts of the Struthers movement in other parts of the country, or the UK, I should say.
Yeah, which was really interesting, because what would happen was I would meet other young people my age who were there because their parents had dragged them along.
Oh wow!
And I just couldn't understand. Remember one time we were kind of, some of us were sat in a tent chatting, and a guy got out some speakers and I think he put on something really benign like Jason Mraz or Jack Johnson, and I was like. And it was like, what if someone hears? But also, we shouldn't be doing this. This is sinful. And they were kind of like, okay.
It's really interesting to me that you didn't have that familial influence, and yet you were so deeply involved. And I wonder if it's because you didn't have your parents kind of bringing you into it. People talk sometimes about having liberal parents who would let their children listen to things like Jason Mraz. If there's no parental guidance there, and you're not having open conversations with your parents about the types of things that might be happening at these groups, whether you've been kind of subtly told not to, or whether you feel like you missed the boat when you didn't tell them that it was a bit strange at that initial session. It's weird that you were almost sort of
leading my own charge into it. I think the big thing is it's the things you experience. So it becomes really difficult once you do stand up and start worshipping with your arms in the air and singing really loud, and in that sense of communal worship, and then eventually speaking in tongues. And there would be points where we would be praying so loud and speaking in tongues, and then I would open my eyes and I would be on the floor.
Oh
I
my
wouldn't
goodness.
know. I wouldn't be able to say. And so you're just so overwhelmed with this like feeling of what I would have said then of, I'm just overwhelmed with the Holy Spirit and God's presence. Now I don't think that, because all religions have religious experiences like this, and so it points to these experiences to lots of different contradictory beliefs. But we were encouraged not to talk to our parents and family about things.
Right.
I remember I can remember a few occasions where I would have asked leaders, like, how do I talk to my parents about this? And there was a young leader who so she had a lot of involvement in leading the young people, and she opened her Bible and read the section where Jesus says, I've come to split apart brother and sister, father and son. And she was like, your family might just not understand. And she was like, it's difficult at the minute because you're under the wing of your parents, but in a few years you won't be, and then we can dig in more and do what. I remember thinking,
Ooh.
like, but obviously at the time I was like, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And talking about how, well, if your family aren't here, they've not had the experience, so they don't know the truth of it. So even if you do talk to them about it openly, they won't get it.
Okay.
But this is at the same time as kind of messaging as, it'd be great if your family came along. We'd love them to join. So it's a weird kind of contradictory.
We'd love them to join on the condition that they
don't know too much before they come.
So that they can also be funneled
Yeah.
into. Okay, so that to me, it kind of shows that perhaps the leadership knew that the things happening in the church were not conventional, but perhaps also not entirely safe. Because I think it's okay to be unconventional.
Yeah.
I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But if you feel the need to control the situation so tightly, then I feel like that speaks to people knowing that there's something maybe not quite right with that situation, especially when you use the language of like, you're not of age yet, but you will be of age soon. That's kind of stepping into grooming territory, I think, which is quite difficult. And you mentioned that on these retreats and at these summer camp type get-togethers, there would be other children who were sent there because of their parents. Was it typical for kids in your youth group to be sent there by parents, or would it have been strange for a kid to have his parents or her parents or their parents involved in the church, and it was kind of you as independent teenagers in the youth group?
Yeah, so with the kind of, I suppose, the generational, the timing of the generations, when I was there as a teenager, there wasn't anybody quite old enough to have had kids my age, and there wasn't anybody, and everyone else was like too old to have kids my age, so their kids were maybe in their 30s. So for our church in my town, most of us that were there my age were there without our parents or family.
Okay.
But in the other churches there would be, and actually some of the other churches there, the kids my age were really into it, and some of them are still there.
You have siblings.
Yeah.
So did any of them join you, or was this like a solo venture?
Yeah, so one of them came for a while.
Okay.
And then I think just wasn't happy anymore, so stopped.
Right.
And at this point, one of my siblings would have been at university, and the other one was just not.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And in terms of having a kind of pronounced or subtle leadership or tier system within the youth group, was there one specific figurehead who led the group, who led the sessions, or who others would take instruction from when they had responsibility?
Yeah, there was, in terms of the church, there was one minister really who ran the church in our town, and then she kind of had a deputy who would sometimes preach and do things as well. And then in terms of the youth activity, there were maybe 4 or 5 people. Some of them, well, so the two leaders would be involved in leading the youth stuff as well, like they were in charge of that. And then there was a few who maybe between the ages of like 18 and 25 who also were involved in leading that too, yeah. And they'd all been brought up in it.
Right. Okay. So this is multi-generational for those people.
Yeah.
And at the point where you become involved, I just released an episode today on the Order of the Solar Temple, and what they would do in this group was that they had a front group where they would talk about alternative medicine and the new age, and they would kind of vet out people that they thought would be candidates to be initiated into their secret society, which was the Order of the Solar Temple. So do you feel like the leaders of the youth group were kind of doing that with some of the attendees in the youth group, feeling out which of those might want to come to church group? Do you feel like that happened with you?
I think so. I think they would say that they would want everyone to come, but in practice, yeah, they were definitely, there were people who they thought would, and people who wouldn't.
Okay, so you said that at this point you are attending most days of the week, sometimes twice a day or 2 services a day. Oh my goodness. So talk us through what your typical daily and weekly church commitments look like at this point.
So the first thing would be when I was kind of like full steam into it, Friday night was the youth group. So I would help run some of the stuff they would do with younger kids, stay and tidy up, have our snacks, and then do our Friday night worship meeting. We would have the next day a Saturday night meeting, and this was the kind of biggest in terms of its the energy and its kind of Pentecostal vibe. So that was the night of really, and that sometimes that would start at 7, 7:30. Sometimes we'd be going at 11:30 still. A lot of like religious experience, laying on of hands, speaking in tongues.
So laying on of hands is this potentially where people would need to, this is actually quite a good aside, because you said that the group that you were a part of wouldn't have necessarily used this language, but casting out a demon.
Yes, yeah.
But they would have phrased it slightly differently.
As deliverance, yeah. So they wouldn't exorcise demons. They would be delivering people from evil spirits or dark spirits.
Right.
Or it might be that they're praying with you to push you further into the depths of God, or free you up from things. So it would be kind of like someone would put their hand on your back, or a couple of people would, and their arms in the air, and it would just be like a charged kind of growing frenzy of like ranting and speaking in tongues, getting louder and louder and louder, until it would almost like crescendo.
Yeah, like a mass hysteria.
Yeah. So that would be the Saturday night. Sunday morning was a little bit more peaceful, and actually more people who weren't regulars of the church might come along to that as well. So that would be kind of quiet prayer, a long sermon, once a month, some communion, and then a little bit of worship time and singing, maybe some very like quiet speaking in tongues and things like that. Sometimes one of my parents might come along to that. And then we would have a Sunday evening, which was kind of like the Saturday night, but almost wrapping up the week in a way. And then on a Monday evening, there would also be a prayer meeting, which I didn't always go to because it was school week.
Yeah.
And that would be where they would pray for specific things in the church that they, people would put in requests for, or things like that.
And then you also mentioned that Wednesday nights they would film services as well as that.
Wednesday nights might be like a craft night, or they might put on a dinner, or it might be that we'd heard a sermon from Scotland had been recorded that we might listen to.
Right. And so really, if you were to be involved in all of those things, it would be 5 out of 7 days of the week.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. And how long does the youth group go on for on a Friday?
So I think I would probably have gotten there about, maybe at 5 o'clock, and then I'd maybe get home at about 10:30, 11.
And then how long do you think you're in church for on the Sunday with the 2 sessions?
Oh gosh, so it would have been about 2 hours in the morning, and then an hour and a half in the evening.
Oh my goodness. So without the prayer meeting and the craft nights on a Wednesday, that's like 12 to 14 hours of your time a week as a teenager.
Yeah.
So exams are pretty wild at that time as well. Yeah. I remember A-levels were really, really overwhelming. So
this is like pushing into GCSE time as well, isn't it? And it was actually kind of around exams, I suppose, the So GCSEs are the exams we sit when we are, 15, 16 that year. And then A-levels being 17 and 18. And it was really around GCSE time that I started to think like, this is not, there are problems here.
Right.
And once you see the cracks, you kind of can't unsee them.
You become integrated into the center of this group. It becomes your social life, your community, and you're attending retreats. I imagine that in some situations we've heard, like with the Unification Church, that these retreats would be used to further indoctrinate people. Would you say that that is what happened at your retreats?
Absolutely, yeah. And some of the practices in the retreats, I think, were especially harmful and still continue. So the big church kind of camps and retreats in Scotland, the Wednesday night was and still is characterized by an evening of deliverance and, well, exorcisms.
Right.
And it's when I was there, it was maybe 300-400 people in this massive hall. There's singing, there's prayer, but everybody knows what's about to happen. So there's a real sense of actually dread. People dread it, but people go because they think it's good for them, or because they've been told to by their parents, or and then there's a big sermon on, it's usually on about hell or sin, evil spirits, that kind of thing, purity and holiness, but it's meant to terrify people. And then in the worship time, the person who leads it claims to have a gift of discernment where God highlights to her in the crowd who's got particular demons that they're battling with, or issues or spirits of darkness on them. And whilst people are meant to have their eyes closed, but obviously not everybody does, she points people out. So she says, the woman on the third row with the red jumper on, look at me. And she'll say, you have a spirit of greed or lust, you need prayer. And so when she's kind of done pointing everybody out, those people that have been pointed out are meant to go to the back of the room for lots of people to lay hands on. And it's really frenzied, shouting, people in this room screaming, crying, yelling. And so that's the kind of thing.
Well, no wonder there's a sense of dread. You're sitting there wondering if it's going to, please don't be me, please don't be me.
Yeah.
Not only because of the experience of being delivered, but also the fact that if you are there because you truly have adopted this belief system and you hold it as part of something that's your identity, something that you live your life by, if you have a woman or a person in leadership that claims to know that you have a lustful soul or a greedy soul, then that's going to negatively impact you and devastate you as well. So not only do you have this kind of build-up of this event that's going to take place where you're going to be the subject of everybody, you know, touching you and in a frenzied manner, you've also got to deal with the fact that you're not holy enough, and that this holy person is picking you out for being broken in some way. So that's got to be horrible.
Yeah. And there was a year I was there where they didn't wait for the worship time. So she pointed at a young person, a teenager, and said, you are practicing witchcraft. You're praying to Satan. You're trying to bring down the leadership. And if you don't stop, she was basically saying, we'll excommunicate you. And she was kind of saying, we've never excommunicated anyone from this church. And of course they kick people out all the time. they don't have a formal procedure for excommunication because they don't have a formal membership list. And talking in front of 400 people, and this is a young person, and young people would be picked out in this meeting because it was almost like, well, you've come here, so you must consent to the activity that's going on. But of course I think you have to be a certain age to consent to activities like that, and also you're not informed.
So it's kind of like if they accidentally put on a TV show with swear words before Watershed. Well, I suppose for you that would have been what you considered to be your normal social life.
Yeah, and I suppose the relationships I had with friends at school and in choir and stuff was a little bit tarnished because there was always a bit of me that felt like, you don't really know.
Holier than thou.
Yeah,
right.
Absolutely. You don't. You say you're Christian, but are you really? And also we were encouraged to not really try to be friends with people outside the church. We were told that you might have people that you know or acquaintances, but they'll never really be your friends because they're living in a world that you're not living in. And I remember one person actually talking about how she was a nurse, and she made friends with a colleague, and they were spending some time together and hanging out quite a lot. And she, God told her, so the leadership told her, that she had to cut this person out of her life. And they still worked together. So she'd get to work, they'd be looking after patients, and this her friend would be like crying and saying, like, what have I done? And she'd say, quite proudly, like, I just had to walk away because
confusing for somebody that had never kind of had a religious experience before.
Yes. But of course, once you do that, then actually you've bought in a little bit more, you've committed something more to this way of life. So to then try to give it up, you're admitting, I shouldn't have done that. That was wrong. This belief system doesn't make sense anymore. So you'd have to give up a whole lot that you've bit by bit given over.
And what would be the consequence for people if they were to keep these sort of worldly friendships?
They just wouldn't. They would be denied certain roles. So you wouldn't, and this is partly kind of why I ended up leaving. So you wouldn't be allowed to be around children in the church.
So it wasn't a spiritual thing. It wasn't like a if you don't submit fully to our teachings,
would be like, so what they wouldn't want to say is you can't come to the church. They would say, anybody's welcome, but if you were not toeing the line, you wouldn't be able to like lead any worship. You wouldn't be allowed to help at Sunday school. You wouldn't be allowed to even like drive people around. You would just be allowed to, when the doors open, come in and take your seat, and at the end leave. And people probably wouldn't speak to you that much. You'd become a bit of an outcast. But they wouldn't stop you from coming in, except for, that kind of example of the witchcraft.
So this belief system, was there any type of apocalyptic or doomsday element to this fire and brimstone imagery that you've mentioned?
So then they don't kind of have any prophecies about the end of the world or anything like that. They do believe, and it would come up in sermons from time to time, that it could happen any minute. They do believe that Jesus will return physically to the world, and that there'll be a judgment day and things like that. But like we were saying before, this kind of watered down, turning an exorcism into a deliverance. So they do have other prophecies around their church, which, before I kind of talk about what they are, I always think it's really interesting when churches and organizations profess to base their entire belief system on the Bible, but yet this organization has what they call the New Year word. So every sermon that's given on New Year, I think it's either New Year's Eve or New Year's Day, the main sermon that's given at the conference is seen as a prophecy for the year ahead. And like, that's not biblical.
Well, no, not for something that was written however many years ago.
There's nowhere in the Bible that says at New Year's Day your church will have a prophecy for the, and they, for example, in their early days, women would wear veils to church, and the Bible does say women should cover their hair when they're in church. It also says that women shouldn't speak in church or instruct a man.
Yep.
They don't, that bit, because most of the women are leaders, which obviously I think women should be leaders in religious organizations, but it's that professing that actually we only believe what the Bible says, except for that bit. And also God revealed to them in the 80s that women don't need to wear veils anymore.
But only to them.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. But yeah, in 2006, the New Year word was a prophecy that there would be a revival, and it was known as the year of the revelation of the Lord. And the idea was that at some point over that coming year, which didn't happen, that people would arrive en masse to this church, and it would just explode in numbers. So then it was kind of carried on to the next year, and then the next year, and it's still, I think, probably humming away in the background somewhere. But certainly when I was there, because this is maybe 2008, so it'd only been a couple of years before, it would come up quite a lot. There's a revival coming. Over time, it's less and less spoken about.
Were you ever at the church on the date that the revival was supposed to happen?
No, so they never said a date, but it should have been in 2006. That's the year that the New Year word was given. But then it was like, well, actually maybe he was just preparing us this year, maybe it's coming later
Right.
down the line, we've just got to trust that this promise will come true. And actually since then the numbers in this church have been, they've closed some churches, it's been going down and down.
You talked about there being restrictions around relationships in terms of who you should and shouldn't be romantic with, and if you do decide that you might have an attraction to somebody, then you would have to clear that with leadership first. In terms of controlling other aspects of your life, were you encouraged to adopt a certain type of diet or clothing?
Yeah, so clothing were, and this bit, I kind of remember it creeping me out a little bit then, actually. Women's clothing was kind of more policed. And I remember one sermon talking about how evil and wrong it is of young school to be wearing short skirts because it can lead older men into a spirit of lust.
Okay.
So it's the fault of the young girls for wearing.
Mm.
And so we weren't meant to wear anything that was like too dark, or so obviously no kind of t-shirts with skulls or anything like that. But women were asked to kind of, like they would all wear long sleeved tops, nothing like strappy, kind of like high necked clothes, nothing too clingy, because that would lead men astray.
It's interesting that as a younger person, you were able to identify that that was perhaps a big red flag, because I think some people might just think, well, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But that's not the way it should be. Interesting that you said about females in leadership, though, because I did want to bring that up. In a lot of high demand religious groups that we talk about on this show, there is no place for women to hold positions of power. And that's not the case in this group.
Yeah.
But the female leadership still has the same coercive effect on congregants that we've seen men have in high demand religious groups. So I don't know if you just had any thoughts or feelings on that as a subject.
So they still will hold biblical beliefs around. So the woman who led the church would say that she was like the hierarchy is that her husband was in charge of her because God's in charge of the husband, which is in the Bible. But then she's in charge of the church. There's particularly to the Corinthians, women need to not talk in church. And I just, obviously, I'm not agreeing with Paul. I think that's awful. Just said, and I don't know why, I never really asked. Cultural reaction to the time, they would probably talk about the women of Corinth as being led astray. So those particular women needed kind of sorting out before they could do anything in leadership. But of course, you're taking one particular Bible and part of the Bible and saying, well, this is contextual, this is particular culture, that there's a deeper message to it. But then the bits that vaguely say something about you probably shouldn't drink alcohol, even though Jesus made wine, they'd be like, no, we don't drink alcohol.
But this is what David's just said here, like cherry picking Bible verses. And that is sort of where the spiritual abuse comes in, I think. Just changing or interpreting like scripture, holy scripture, to suit the agenda or intentions of leadership, to kind of tell you why you should separate yourself from your family and your friends, to sit down with someone in leadership who as David said, cherry picks Bible verses to tell you why you should estrange yourself from people that aren't regular churchgoers. And that is so manipulative, and I think can really damage somebody's relationship with their faith for the rest of their lives. So
and of course, because they knew the Bible inside out, and I didn't. I'd never sat down and read the Bible. I did in my time there get through the whole Bible, but they could, you could mention a thing and they'd be able to say, well, it's this verse, it's this verse, it's this verse, and I wouldn't know. You don't know. So then you think, oh well, they know. They must know. They know it inside out. Great, you can trust them.
And when someone's standing sort of like at the pulpit or whatever word people might use in their group setting or church setting, they say it with such fervor and passion and righteous anger sometimes that you don't think that there is any way they don't know what they're talking about, or there's absolutely no way that they could be wrong about this, because they say it with such conviction. I think that's certainly how I would take it.
What's interesting, though, and it's typical of churches like this, is that the sermons might go on for an hour, but it's based off of 1 or 2 verses in the Bible. So actually the majority of it is just what the preacher thinks, which I just think is fast. And I'm not saying that's a right. I actually think that's probably quite a liberal approach to scripture, to take some inspiration from it and then do a kind of talk on it. But actually they're presenting it as God's word.
And you mentioned that you were encouraged not to watch certain films or TV shows or listen to certain music. So was there any other overt restrictions that you were encouraged to take part in?
Yes. So when I was about 14, the leader of the church sat me down and asked and said she would like to take control of my reading. And those are the words that she used.
Wow.
Of course, I said, great, what do you want me to read? I want to control what you read.
So if you were somebody who was going to pick up the Harry Potter series at that point...
Oh, no. Harry Potter is not allowed.
It's
Witches and wizards.
It's always Harry Potter,
bizarre.
though. It's always Harry Potter. The question on what the consequences would be if that person was to keep that friendship with the person she worked with. Because a lot of the time, it's, if you don't follow the rules of the church to the letter, then you are going to hell. Your soul will be damned. You're going to affect your entire lineage for years to come. You'll place a curse on your family. All manner of things that impact your spiritual self. But here it sounds like it was very much, the consequences would be taking away the privileges or so-called privileges that you would be allowed to have in the church group, which is really interesting.
But the reason for that would be because they would have seen that you maybe had a spirit of darkness in you. So you couldn't be trusted to run the Sunday school because actually you're not holy enough to do that job. And churches, organizations like this are very clever to inbuild ways of avoiding critique, because then you can say, why are you kicking me out? And then, no, we're not kicking you out. You're very welcome to come on a Sunday. You just can't go be with the kids anymore until you sort your spiritual problems out. And of course,
spiritual problems means being more obedient to the rules of the church. Okay.
And the word obedience would be used openly as well. It would be the kind of the line of the leadership was, don't question what we ask you to do. Sometimes I don't even understand it myself. It's just what God's telling me that we need to do. So if you question what I'm saying, you're questioning God. And it would be like, even if you think it's wrong, you still need to do it.
So at what point, you said that it was around GCSEs that you started to notice kind of major red flags, and once the cracks appeared, there were things that you just couldn't unsee.
Yeah.
So what would you say the kind of the turning point or catalyst was for that experience?
So I was fully in and digging in and 100% committed. And then there was a sermon given on a Friday night after, when we all stayed back. And it was from the leader of the church, basically saying some of the things I've just said, that if you didn't come to church on a Friday, a Saturday, and 2 times on a Sunday, that you wouldn't be allowed to work with young people in the church anymore. And some people have been doing that for years and years, and they were brilliant at it, and the kids loved them. And some of them had been like, led games when I was a kid, and they were just really fun. And it was confusing, because I remember thinking, well, surely not her. She's great, and she's been coming to this church since she was a kid. You can't be really saying that she's not pure enough or good enough in some way to work with kids. And after that sermon, there was one person in particular that we didn't see the next few weeks. I remember thinking, and then there was one person in particular, and I won't say too much about them just to keep it kind of private, but there was a person who had experience of being in care who was told, you're not good enough to be working with kids. And this was a young person at the time. And just the safeguarding issues around that and the harm that would cause to somebody who's had that experience. I remember that was the point where I was just like, this isn't right, this is wrong. So I asked the leader, went on a Saturday night, just said, can I speak to you after, because I've got a few questions. She said, yeah, okay. And I just said, I don't understand, I feel like it's hurting people and I don't think that's what God would want. And she was just very blunt in, well, it's what God's asking me to say, so this is what we're doing. It's like, okay.
So what if people are like full-time carers or have strange shift patterns in work or have had a particularly difficult week with personal matters and that
or was having a difficult year, or
and they have this hanging over them that if they can't fully commit to all of those church services, they would have some of the most valuable experiences and privileges that they have at that church taken from them.
And I remember thinking, and actually the people who this was said to got the message, and obviously because the message was, stop coming to this church, please.
Right.
And so because I was brushed off, I felt like we had some exams coming up, and they were going away on a retreat into the Yorkshire Dales, and I wasn't going to go because I wanted to revise for my exams, and they kind of said, yeah, that seems fair. So I asked, I was like, is there a last minute place I'd like to go? Because I thought, if I can go and we're in the middle of the Yorkshire Dales in a bunk barn, you can't brush me off because we'll be there for 3 days. So we went, and I said to her, I really want to speak to you. And so we set aside like 10 or 15 minutes, and we sat and we argued for about 3 hours.
Wow. And
I was just like, it doesn't, and I was going through the Bible and being like, it says this, it doesn't say that. And she's like, you need to, and I'm saying, but what? I've talked to my parents about it, and even they think this is really wrong. And she was saying things like, well, your parents aren't spiritually mature. How would they know? And I just got really like, and that was, I think, someone came and knocked on the door and said, it's time for us to start our little worship meeting now. So she said, okay, we can finish it after. And that was the moment where I just thought, I can't. And I was so sad. And we sat in the meeting, and there was the sermon, and at the end, all the worship and prayer. And I just sat and cried for about, and they all thought, oh, whoa, he's having a great religious experience. So come around, putting their hands on me and stuff. And I was just so sad because I was like, this is such a good thing, and it's gone so sour. And the next thing then was, all right, I need to find a church who is like as holy and as Pentecostal and Bible believing as all of this. So then called one of the friends who had been kicked out, and we went to a mega church in Bradford, and there's like this rock music starts and there's smoke machines, and we were like, what? And there's a Starbucks and people are jumping up and down. We were like, is this church? And we just realized there was so much out there that we just had no idea. We'd been so tunnel vision, and obviously we didn't stay long at this mega church either, because obviously that's obviously a whole other feast of oddness. And
those people in that church having those different experiences would have felt just as holy as you did, with the Starbucks and the rock music. Absolutely. And I think that's really interesting. I think it's important to recognize and remember that there are commonalities and threads amongst religious groups that makes them appealing, that makes them people's entire communities and social lives, like you've mentioned. And one of the things that I kind of wanted to speak about with you personally, face to face, is the whole thing around how the LGBTQIA plus community is treated in the majority of religious settings, because most of the mainstream religions are not accepting of this particular community group, and whether that's Islam, or whether that's Christianity, or whether that's Catholicism. So you, as somebody who does have a male partner, when did you come to realize in yourself that you might be a gay man?
It was a really interesting journey because probably at the time where I would have been realizing relationships were against the rules, full stop. So actually, any sort of desire was just like, if there was some kind of like gay desire, I would have been like, oh, that's just Satan. He's just leading me astray. Yeah, naughty Satan. But I wouldn't have been able to have a relationship with a girl anyway. So it was kind of. But as I started leaving, I remember really thinking like, come on, you are definitely a gay man. This is fine. And actually, I spoke to a friend at school, and I just remember thinking, if I come out, friend, that will draw the line under this whole church thing, because they will never accept me back.
Right.
At all. I just remember thinking, being a little bit scared, what if I go back? Like, what if I get tempted to it because it felt so good, or all that kind of thing? So I told a friend, and then she encouraged me to tell another friend, and then there was another friend, and then the four of us would do our exam revision together, and then we'd plot out like, oh, who should you tell next? And then obviously a couple of people like spread it on the sixth form, whatever. And after a while, I told my family, and then it was like, that helped me to cement, to say, because that is just a like putting a square peg in a round hole. There is no, in this organization, gay people are just going to hell,
and that was something
question.
that was talked about in the church sessions,
openly, and still is, and I know it still is. And they've spoken in some of their sermons recently as well about kind of trans issues, and that it's just kind of people are hellbound. There's no conversation, no discussion. It's the fundamentalist interpretation of Sodom and Gomorrah. But within the wider, I think the wider, it's potentially, and this might be interesting as well for the viewers across the pond, that actually some of the, certainly the Christian groups in the UK have actually been at the heart of the gay rights movement since the very start. So certainly the Quakers, and that's the same in the States, the Quakers have always been kind of on side and have been campaigning openly for gay rights since like the early 50s. So you're kind of talking even pre-Stonewall at that point. It's kind of campaigning from within. And the Church of England is potentially, I think it's the biggest proper formal Christian organisation in England, and then the Church of Scotland. But then they're part of the Anglican communion, which brings together church from all around the world. So then they're suddenly debating with people from countries where there's still the death penalty for gay people. So they're towing a really strange line where they actually do want to be able to marry gay couples, for example, but they know if they do that, they'll be cut out of the Anglican communion, and then their influence on other parts of the world where it's really still quite hardline and fundamentalist is lost. And so they're kind of thinking, and I don't envy that position, to want to campaign for it, but to know that if you do, that on the other side of the world, that'll really negatively impact people.
Yeah, it's almost like to kind of like put a really simple analogy to a really difficult subject, like how can you play the best music for people if you're kicked out of the party?
Yes, yeah.
Wow. So it wasn't like you had fully developed your kind of sexual identity as a young teenager moving into the center of the church group, but something that you identified as you were coming out of the other end.
Yeah.
So do you think that there is the potential for LGBTQIA plus individuals to be in these environments within this church right now and having those experiences where they feel like they can't be truly their authentic selves?
100%, absolutely. I know quite a few people who have left, who have then come out some way as trans or as gay or bi, or are in same-sex relationships. In fact, almost strangely more than I know from other religious settings, which is, I don't know if there's something in that, if there's people often talk about how gay kids find each other before they know they're gay. All my friends from high school are gay. None of us knew when we met. And
I feel like it's quite a theatre thing, isn't it? As well, I know that that's quite stereotypical, but
maybe that's where we find each other.
There were only three and a half, because one guy never showed up to our course. But there were three guys.
Yeah.
2 of you were openly.
Yeah.
gay,
Yeah.
but not interested in each other, even though
no.
everyone was like, well, doesn't it just make sense that you'd be together? But I could never see that as
No.
a pairing. That would be interesting. But
and actually a lot of people who've left who had a lot of mental health issues as well. And I suppose you can't know if that would be the case if they hadn't been a part of the church. But, and this is nothing actually, mental health issues don't exist in this
I was going to
church.
ask, yeah.
It's demons and it's dark spirits, and
So-
you're delivered from these things. Things like therapy and treatment are not at all
So there's
considered.
another potentially marginalised community group within high demand religious groups, especially across mainstream Christianity. There could be people that have hereditary mental health issues or ill mental health through, childhood trauma, where they feel as if they are doing something wrong or as if there's something wrong with them, or that they can't be their, again, authentic selves.
Yeah.
Much like, and I mean, if you were to combine those two things together, a young gay man growing up with ill mental health in a church setting, how exacerbated might that be in such an insular community where you really feel unsupported by the only community that you have, and that's really important to kind of think about, and to try and reckon with in terms of talking about high demand religious groups and marginalized communities. And I suppose another major one to discuss would be on how the church viewed Black, Indigenous, or people of color within the church as well, because the Brethren historically are quite racist in their doctrines, their belief systems, in segregation, who they would and wouldn't allow within their group. So would you say that is something that was part of your church group or not?
I mean, so there wasn't a kind of open racism, and obviously I'm speaking from the perspective of someone who's white, but most people in the church were also white, and the town that I grew up in is quite diverse, so I think that says something about who felt welcome there. But there was an open. So, for example, I had a friend whose was a family were Hindu, and I was warned about going to their house because of their religion, that there might be demons or spirits there. And there was, similar conversations about Islam as being kind of like a false religion and false gods and false idols. But there was also talk about that in terms of other Christian groups as well. The Catholics were often poked at, but specifically religions from the global South were much talked about as being kind of Satan and dangerous actually for your spiritual well-being, and to avoid people that practice them because of the idols and imagery that people might have in their house.
I love the Hindu idols.
Yeah.
They're beautiful, aren't they? I could look at them all day. Like some of the different there's like Shiva, Ganesha. There's some incredible. I'm trying to think of some others as well. Is it Ram and Sita, or is that different?
I don't know. I'm not very well versed, but
yeah, there's some incredible like deities in the Hindu faith. I would rather, I don't know. In terms of iconography,
to tell someone you shouldn't really go to someone's house because they're Hindu. I mean, it's just thinly veiled racism. Yeah.
Isn't there only one or two lines in the Bible that hint towards or have been misinterpreted? And that's kind of where a lot of the homophobia comes from in the churches.
Yes, I mean, there wasn't a word for homosexual or gay at the time that the Bible was written. And I mean, there's some debate, and I think often in the gay community, we often like to pretend that places like ancient Greece were really liberal and welcoming.
I'd say that they were.
They were, but not necessarily the same way that like we are now.
No, and maybe not in a good way either.
No,
because I think a lot of it was to do with young boys as opposed to like men with men or women with women.
But of course, the heterosexual relationships that existed at that time don't really bear any resemblance to, certainly in the UK, heterosexual relationships. It's not a contract of ownership. It's not to do with family honor. It's not to do with the movement of wealth. or securing bloodlines or anything like that. It's not arranged. Well, it shouldn't be. Probably it is still sometimes, but it's not conventionally arranged. As a child, we're not marrying older men off with younger women. And I mean, and that's the biblical story of Mary and Joseph. So even the heterosexual relationships in the Bible don't bear any resemblance to contemporary relationships. So the idea that we should also ban gay relationships because that's not, because it's a different cultural context. Yeah.
And that is spiritual. I think that that's spiritual abuse. And it makes me sad to think of all those people in these high demand religious groups, whether that's Jehovah's Witnesses, whether that's Pentecostalism, whichever branch of Pentecostalism, whether, you know, the major ones like the Assemblies of God, or whether you're from a small church group in Leeds, that there are people suffering because they feel like they can't tell people that they're attracted to, you know, their best mate's sister, that they can't, I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, I talk about this all the time, but yeah, so you started to notice the cracks. You had this lengthy sit down with the leader. You were openly emotional, probably in grief, I imagine, at that time, realizing that everything that you had been a part of, this community that you'd given years to, your entire belief system was kind of like up in the air at that point. Where'd you go from there?
Yeah. So I think that was the first thing was me and a couple of the others, right, we need to find a new church. So we did that. And I thought, do we really? Having a bit of a break from it and thinking, and then later, maybe about a year after or much later in the year, we'd planned a huge school trip and we spent a month in Peru.
Yes,
yeah. I used to be at uni. When we were in Peru.
Oh, Sam's been to Peru, has he? Oh, I didn't know that.
But we went for it was quite a lot of us from the sixth form, which is like our upper end of school, the college, and we did. So there was 5 teams of like 20 pupils went. We spent a month there, and I was in a team with a lot of my really good friends, and actually just having a month away from. We weren't allowed to take phones with us, so any kind of catching up with the real world was done once a week in an internet cafe for 10 minutes if we wanted to. So that was just like a clean break, and we were literally, for some of it, one point we were an 8-hour drive and then 3 full days of walking away from the nearest small town. So we were literally in as far away from civilization as you could be. And when it's just you and other people in that setting, it was so easy to realize, like, yeah, there's more to life after this now. I don't have to go back to it.
Did anything happen in Peru in terms of like botflies and stuff? Is that what would happen in Peru?
What?
You know, like, I always I feel like I want to go and visit like these amazing places, but I'm always scared of like insects and bugs that crawl into your skin and like, I don't know, would that happen in Peru?
Yeah, well, we were in the south, and we spent a lot of time at a high altitude, so there's less of that.
Right.
But some of my friends went to the north and were in like the edge of the Amazon basin, and there was a lot of like, there was kind of like a don't pee in the river.
Yeah, because of the I don't know. That sort of thing just like creeps me out. But
that was a really liberating time. And when I was out there, I came out to some of my friends, and it was just really like, yeah, there's
I love that.
Life after this now. It was lovely. Yeah.
Then
after that, I just had the best time in school. And so I only had a year left, but I had a good time before.
Like, I'm gonna make the most of it.
But the last year, I just had like a really cracking time, and yeah.
So what was your relationship like with your faith after your misadventure with this group?
So it's a weird one, because I think it's hard to, it comes back to the experience stuff, that actually I can't deny that I experienced profound moments that I think now I could quite explain, but then how do you explain it? How do you kind of, and that's the thing that comes into your head from time to time, that And that's what the church would say. They'd say, it's true, you felt it, so you can't argue now, you can't pretend that. So I think for a while I was kind of like quite staunchly atheist. I think I went the other way, and I'm still an atheist, but maybe not so much in the like Richard Dawkins.
Right.
If you believe in God, you're dumb kind of. I just don't believe in God.
Do you feel like it's this group's influence that has really that's really stopping you from being able to consider a relationship with your faith, or
No, I think to try and unpack the experiences and what had happened, I think the thing that is try to read about from different perspectives. So reading about from non-spiritual writers, reading about religion from non-religious writers, and I mean some of this is like hardcore academic stuff. So like as an example, speaking in tongues, you speak in tongues and you feel it, and you do feel like you're channeling something. There's an energy that you don't understand. You feel like you're in the presence of God. But speaking in tongues, or like the formal word for what it is, glossolalia. Glossolalia.
That's a
Tell me
new
if I'm saying that wrong. In the ancient Greek and Roman world, it was just a common religious practice. It was just believed that the ancient Greek and Roman gods spoke languages that humans didn't know. And so high priests or prophets or all sorts of kind of people, if you could speak in the language of the gods, you had a really high status within society or within religious elites. And obviously the time of the New Testament and Pentecost and all of this is in Roman occupation. Lots of the early Christians were Jewish converts who were Greek Jewish converts and who spoke Greek as their primary language. So this kind of knowledge of that kind of religious practice it's not new. It wasn't an invention. And it, you can trace back, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years before that, kind of the Oracle of Delphi at the Temple of Apollo, who would do that as well in the kind of is written about in the early times. So when you read things like that, you go, actually, if speaking in tongues and that experience is the thing that validates this belief system, then actually it also validates Zeus and Hera at the top of Mount Olympia. And it also validates so like the Assemblies of God, I think, don't believe in the Trinity. They're like a oneness, or maybe it's a branch of that. Does it validate the Trinity, or does it validate God as oneness? Or some Pentecostal churches don't even believe Jesus is like a God, but God is God. Does it validate that belief? And so when you read about it, you go, oh, okay, then actually it's not a spiritual thing.
Wow.
It's a thing that my body did.
So this is like your deconstruction process.
Yeah. And so reading about the history of the Christian God, like where did actually, because I don't believe that Moses wrote the first 4 or 5 books of the Bible, because they were written 800 years after the time that it's meant to describe. So who wrote it 800 years after, and what was actually happening in the time that they were meant to describe? And at that time, actually, when Moses was meant to exist, the ancient Israelites believed in a whole pantheon of gods. God had a wife. And so you dig into that and you kind of start to go, well, okay, now I kind of can relax a bit. I don't need to worry that this might have been true, because actually lots of these experiences are true of lots of different religions throughout recorded human history.
And how many times has the original writing been translated? What's been lost or mistranslated? And what
and left out,
and purposefully as well. If you think about the King James Bible, like there's obviously agendas for King James to translate that Bible in a way that benefits his agenda at that time in English history. So it's interesting just to contemplate even newer versions of the Bible, what's been mistranslated, what's been left out. And we'll never really know from the original scriptures what they said in their true language, because I don't know if you can ever fully translate from ancient Latin to English as we speak it today, and all of the variations of it in between.
And is like the having like an authentic original text doesn't even work in these settings, because it's essentially the writing down of tradition. So that you might think about the writing Exodus 600 to 800 years later is the writing down of like the Moses tradition. They're writing down a belief system,
Yeah.
and actually that doesn't mean that it happened. And it's the same with the New Testament. None of the people who wrote the New Testament ever met Jesus, if he even existed.
Yeah. But I do also see the value in taking religious texts and using them to as sort of like basic life principles.
Absolutely, yeah.
Guidelines on how to be a good person, how to be a decent and contributing person in society, a caring person, a person that you can sit down with and have a conversation on whether God does or doesn't exist. And I think that there is merit and also positivity that can come from having a belief system. And I also believe that there are positive religious communities that do exist out there, where people have communities where they are bolstered.
Being critical of kind of abusive or high demand religious settings doesn't mean that you kind of don't also have respect for people with other faiths. And actually, it's worth remembering that this is an organization that doesn't respect other belief systems, even within Christianity. And so they should be open to critique, because they openly critique other ones too. And actually, you can also respect religious belief systems and still critique them.
Yeah.
And have that kind of, it can be productive and happy. But I think that's really important to like the kind of work that you're doing doesn't necessarily mean religion bashing.
No,
because
no,
actually
absolutely
it's not. It's a different thing, isn't it?
So I guess my last few questions is to ask you, did you ever talk to your family about this?
Yeah, on and off. Yeah. Were they filled in? They know now.
Right.
Yeah. And I think on reflection, I mean, parents know more than you think they know when you're. So even though I wasn't telling them stuff as a teenager, they probably did, or a bit more. But yeah, they know now. And actually, sometimes they've said to me, kind of, how on earth did we go along with it? And I'm quite honest with them and say, well, we didn't tell you everything. So
yeah.
But yeah. And sometimes, and it's interesting, everyone kind of deals with this stuff in a different way. And sometimes it's a bit of a joke. If we're having a bit of a laugh, it's always or a bit of a jokey argument, especially with my brothers. It always comes back to well, you joined.
No.
Which is, we always, and I think maybe for some of them it was a bit of a backflip to be like, aren't you a fundamentalist Christian? And me be like, no, I'm gay now. Like, that was last week. I think it was quite
I'm gay
as
now.
a teenager, they must have been like, what is going on?
Oh, it's funny
I'm
that
gay now and I'm going to drama school. So.
Yeah, it's funny that you're flippant about it, but I just had absolutely no idea. I never would have looked at you and our time together at university and thought, if I talked to you about a really bizarre Breaking Bad reference, you would not know what I was talking about.
Not at all.
And you are a big Harry Potter fan.
Well, so because I read Harry Potter as a young person before,
right,
and then I stopped reading it, and then I think the last film came out maybe in our first year at uni or just before.
Yeah, it wasn't long before, I don't think.
Yeah, anyway, so I caught up before the last film came out.
You were like really excited, so you were like back with them.
Yeah.
That's so funny. Right, so we're going to sign off and we're going to say goodbye to everybody. David has said thank you so much for telling your story.
Thank you.
And I would just like to echo that. Thank you so much for coming to sit down with me in an interview with a cult survivor.
Yeah.
I can't believe that I've known you this long and we're only in conversation. And both at an informed level as well, because it's one thing to say to somebody, I was in a cult, and then it's another thing to say to somebody, I was in a cult and that person say, talk me through that
Mm,
coercive psychology. So that's been really interesting for me today, and it's just been great to sit down and catch up. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having
Sam.
me. Yeah, happy to be here.
Thank you so much for
Bye.
everyone that tuned in, and we'll speak to you all again soon. Bye bye bye. That is the end of this bonus episode. If you'd like to get in touch, you can find me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com or follow me on Twitter and Instagram at cultvaultpod. I'm your speaker Casey, host of the Cult Vault podcast.